So continuing then with my analysis of Derrida's Grammatology and moving on into the second to last chapter in the book. This is chapter 3 of part 2, which is called Genesis and Structure of the Essay on the Origin of Languages. Specifically, this will be a deconstruction of Rousseau's Essay on the Origins of Languages, which is a relatively obscure work of his. And this is the longest chapter in the book. It's also one of the best, and you can see that everything that Derrida has developed hitherto comes to a head at this part of the book and develops into a grand deconstructive pyrotechnical finale, as it were. What happens in this chapter is that, first of all, what I want to do is give you the key, the metaphysical key to understanding what Derrida is doing. And it is a kind of metaphysics. It's an anti-metaphysical metaphysics. But there is a mythic structure going on here. And if you understand the key to what he's doing, the basic pattern that he keeps reiterating, that he has reiterated in every chapter of the book, but that he also reiterates in the other essays in books like Dissemination and Margins of Philosophy, then you'll have Derrida. You'll understand what he's doing. And it is simply this. As he characterizes the metaphysical tradition, the logocentric tradition, the tradition of metaphysical presence, he always characterizes that tradition in terms, as we know, of pairs of opposites. So you have to imagine in your mind a kind of diagram in which you see metaphysical pairs of opposites that say speech and writing. And of the two, one of those two is always privileged hierarchically over the other, which is excluded. And the excluded one, in this case writing, is on the outside. It's purely exterior from the thing that is interior. So there's always an interior, whether it's the Cartesian cogito, or whether it's speech, or whether it's nature and culture is seen as something exterior, or in Saussure, whether it's linguistics, to which writing is seen as exterior and a mere supplement. That interior is always a fundamental plenitude of self-presence. It's not just self-presence, it's the idea that it's perfectly self-contained, a plenitude, exactly like the myth of the primordial being, what in the Upanishads is called the Hiranyagarbha, or the golden self, the cosmic embryo, in the creation of the Big Bang from the generation of a singularity. It's that fundamental unity, that egg that is at the center, that is not in any need of anything, and anything that is added to it is merely exterior and is merely supplementary. So the supplement is seen in this sense as something entirely prosthetic, technical, artificial, and add-on. Not really necessary, because there's a plenitude there without difference. Now, what Derrida's strategy is then is always to take those two pairs of opposites and put the outside on the inside. He wants to go back and always show you that, in fact, what is normally excluded as the second term, as the deprivileged term, as outside the membrane, the immunological membrane of the metaphysical system, actually was always already there to begin with on the inside as part of the initial conditions that enabled the generation of the system to begin with in the first place. That's basically différance. But it's also the idea that Derrida reframes the idea of the supplement. The supplement is no longer an added-on thing or a threat to the system that's erected. It's something that was always already there on the inside of the system as a kind of crack or defect or flaw, a lack that was fundamentally there in the system all along. Exactly as in chaos theory, as anyone knows who's studied complex dynamical systems theory, it's based on an exquisite sensitivity to initial conditions, such that if there's an initial flaw at the beginning of the system, it'll become more and more and more and more pronounced over time. Same thing with what Derrida is doing here. It's a kind of cosmology. It's his own cosmology that's very consistent with that of chaos theory, insofar as he's finding that which is said to be antipathetic, exterior, and on the outside, as always already part of the initial conditions of the system that make the generation of the pairs of opposites within that system, once the symmetry breaks, as it were, once the singularity gives rise to a cosmos, as it were, makes it possible. And that's what différance is, of course. It's that possibility for spacing, for intervals. He mainly means the granular, by différance he means, of course, the spacing, the granular structure of language that enables differences between metaphysical terms to be generated, and also in so doing that defers meaning through time. Meaning is always deferred. So that's, in a nutshell, that's in your mind. What you should always have in your mind's eye whenever you're reading Derrida. I recently went on Amazon and wrote a customer review of Grammatology, and I saw that a lot of the reviews on there were largely negative, saying that this book was unintelligible, the reviewers couldn't make sense out of it, and that's all complete nonsense. It's a perfectly intelligible book. It's very clear to me if it's read carefully and with a certain amount of patience. One of the reasons why I like to do these videos is because it helps people get past the initial thresholds of difficulty with writers like Heidegger and Deleuze and Derrida that intimidate so many people, that if they get the basic concepts first, then they can sail right on into the texts on their own and find all kinds of things on their own. That's why I do these videos, is to dispel that myth, the myth that Sokal and Brigmont, in their book Fashionable Nonsense, where they dismissed all of these postmodern writers as basically propagating nonsense because they were too intellectually lazy to bother to sit down in this age of attention deficit disorder, and also operating out of the arrogance of the scientific point of view that anything that isn't immediately certain and crystal clear is to be dismissed. It's simply a manifestation of the attention deficit disorder of the age that we're living in. Fashionable nonsense, this stuff is not. It's very clear to anyone with a will to understand it, to sit down and work your way through it. So what he does then in this chapter, and it's a long one, is to discuss this treatise of Rousseau, which is the essay on the origin of languages. And what he finds in the essay is that it is not just an essay on the origin of languages, but it's also simultaneously an essay on the origins and degeneration of music. So it contains within it a musicological theory in which Rousseau identifies music with speech. He says that music begins with song, and song is, of course, speech. Song is simply slowed down speech. And so music originates with song. That's its fundamental thing. And in its origins, it's based on melody. Melody is the fundamental essential thing about music, and melody is based, of course, on an imitation of nature. You can whistle melodies. There's lots of melody in Mozart, for example. There's a lot you can imitate. And that's the fundamental thing about music, and he says that what corrupts music, so this is the interior that he's building for music, melody. What corrupts music is, of course, harmony. That is to say, polyphony, which is a Northern European construct, an aesthetic that was invented by the North, and it's an original contribution of Faustian Gothic civilization to history, and Rousseau objects to it. For him, it becomes exterior, supplemental in a disturbing sense that threatens the integrity of music in its origins, threatens melody by garbling it, threatens melody, and Rousseau wasn't alone here in objecting to polyphony, objecting to harmony as something that obscured music. The church generally initially objected to it anyway on the grounds that you couldn't make out the words anymore in the music, and that it was regarded as frivolous and an unnecessary ornamentation to music. And Rousseau is basically guilty of perpetuating that cliched opinion of the 18th century, early 18th century, before the explosion. He's writing before the explosion here, really, of Mozart, and although this is the time of Rameau, to which he's responding in this essay, and Bach and Bach's sons and so forth. So classical music was moving on into the ascendancy, not the decline, but he portrays, Rousseau makes the mistake of portraying classical music as entering into its decline due to polyphony, which he believes, harmony, that is, garbles it, messes it up. And it becomes more and more, because harmony is not something that you can imitate. Harmony is not based on an imitation of nature, whereas melody is. Harmony then is something artificial. It's something added on, something that threatens the integrity of melody, which is based on imitation. And so he aligns melody with nature, polyphony, harmony is aligned with artifice, and it's condemned as supplemental and a threat to the system. But of course, and then he says part of the problem with the decline of music then is that the gradual covering over of the voice, the effacing of melody and the effacing of voice, as the voice drops out, so does classical music decline. And so what we get in the time that Rousseau is writing is his theory of the decline of classical music, which is of course complete nonsense. Rousseau obviously did not understand classical music to the degree which someone like either Ernst Bloch, let's say, in his Spirit of Utopia did, or Oswald Spengler in The Decline of the West, both of whom correctly saw polyphony as of the essence of the greatness of classical music. It is precisely as Spengler says in the Decline of the West, the degree to which classical music disembodied itself, the degree to which it divorced and effaced the voice. It begins with Gregorian chant, which is almost entirely voice, and the voice gradually drops out over time, along with physical elements like the basso continuo. Those gradually drop out, and the music becomes more and more sublime, more sublated in the Hegelian sense, more abstract, more ethereal, more metaphysical, more otherworldly, until by the time you get to virtually the time that Rousseau's writing here, the time of the late 18th century, of course, with Mozart and Haydn and Stamitz and Gluck, we have it at its apogee. Its absolute transcendent achievement as one of the great arts of form in history, which Rousseau completely missed. He just missed the boat on this, I think. And so his theory about the decline of music due to polyphony is, of course, total and utter nonsense. But it's linked with his theory of language. And so what Derrida then wants to go on to do, part of the problem then, what he wants to do is to show then, again, back to his model in which the thing that has been excluded is actually on the inside. Derrida points out that Rousseau says that melody is an imitation of nature, but as it imitates nature, it also harmonizes with nature, so that harmony, though it appears to be excluded from the system, is actually one of the constitutive conditions on the inside of the system that was already there all along within melody. It's part of it in a nascent form that enabled the generation of the system, of Rousseau's system of pairs of opposites in the first place, à la différence, which is that principle of spacing and differentiation which enables these pairs of opposites through friction, one would imagine, to emerge. So the outside, once again, is found to be present on the inside. And so, therefore, Derrida deconstructs Rousseau's theory of music in that sense. Then he moves on to talk about the origin of languages per se in this treatise, in which Derrida describes languages. He describes a fundamental, he has a myth, and it's a kind of myth of the fall, where he sees language coming into being as the result of a catastrophe, in which we have an initial state of barbaric plenitude. So here's our metaphysical interior of plenitude again that he constructs. The barbarians, before civilization has come into being, and are existing in a state of nature, and the seasons do not yet exist, and so it's just this endless state of pure plenitude. So what is it then, Rousseau asks, that shifted, that brought about society, and along with it, language? What brought that into being? And it turns out to be a cosmic catastrophe. I don't think he specifies it in the text here, but it's a cosmic catastrophe that he suggests, at least metaphorically, is the touch of God tilting the Earth's axis from its direct upright to its 23-degree axial tilt, which of course causes the seasons to come into being, and hence metaphysical polar pairs of opposites, warm, hot, the difference engine of the Earth, winter and summer. All the metaphysical pairs of opposites come into being, and for that reason that begins to create a tension within human culture between a north and a south. So we have a north, by north he characterizes generally the Germanic language families, and the south are the southern language families, but it also includes the Orient, the origins of civilization in Egypt and so forth. It includes all of that in the warm south, and he privileges the south over the north. The south he identifies with passion, life, vitality, and where language originated, and the north he identifies with need. The north the north is basically supplemental to the south, suffers from a fundamental lack, a need. And in the north, the first lack was felt after this cosmic catastrophe as the cold in the north. That led to the invention of fire as the supplement that created the hearth, that drew men together around the hearth and brought society together, in language in the north. And he says that language in the north is based on articulation, that is to say on clarity, but it lacks the mellifluous accentuation of the languages of the south. The languages of the south are based on accent. So his difference engine is north, south, intellect, heart, or intellect, passions, head, heart, and the mellifluity, the accent of language. Italian is the beautiful language and so forth. The Romance languages, they have accent, they have life, but they are lacking in articulation, which belongs to the north, and the north has clarity of understanding in order to make up for what it lacks in terms of life and vitality. So this is the myth that Rousseau creates. And then corresponding in the south to the origin of civilization, there we have, since the south is warm, we have the water well. So people draw together around the water well, as of course they do in the Bible. In the book of Genesis, of course, everybody meets everybody when they're going to the well to draw water. That's where Jacob meets his wife and so forth. the well becomes the point of origin in the south that corresponds to the point of origin of fire in the north, around which everybody gathers and begins civilization.